You think you know everything about the brutality of the Middle Ages because you've heard legends about Count Dracula. Forget it. The real terror wasn't him, but the man who raised him. The man who showed the future impaler that to win, you can and must become a monster. This isn't a story about knightly honor and shining armor. This is the chronicle of how one stubborn old man decided to play a deadly game with the most powerful empire in the world, and turned his own country into a giant trap. How do you stop an army of 40,000 blades if you stand no chance in open battle? Mircea the Elder's answer shocked Europe. He used biological warfare centuries before its invention. He turned water and food into poison. He made elite janissaries afraid of their own shadows and die not by the sword, but from madness and filth. In this video, you will learn how to drown invincible cavalry in a swamp just by picking the right spot. You will see how the greatest heroes of Europe perished because of their own pride, and you will understand why sometimes a signature on a piece of paper is scarier than a dagger blow. We will tell you how to survive when all your allies have betrayed you, and what terrible price had to be paid so that the lineage of Dracula could enter history. Ready to see the underside of the legend? Then get comfortable. Welcome to the hell at Rovine. Imagine the smell. Take a deep breath. It's not the scent of triumph or the aroma of Eastern spices. It's the stench of rotting leaves, damp wool, and fear that seems to have taken physical form. You are standing on the banks of the Danube. Greasy, black mud squelches under your boots. You are part of the deadliest military machine of the 14th century. You are a janissary, and you have just made a fatal mistake. You stepped onto the soil of Wallachia. Remember everything you know about knightly romances, about noble duels, fluttering banners, and honor. Now take that, wad it up, and throw it into the fire. Because the story we are starting is not an epic about heroes. It is a textbook on survival in hell. It is the chronicle of how one stubborn old man, whom history will remember as Mircea the Elder, decided to play Russian roulette with the world's most powerful empire. And, spoiler alert, the gun wasn't loaded with bullets. It was loaded with emptiness. Sultan Bayezid I, nicknamed the Thunderbolt, was not used to waiting. His nickname isn't a metaphor, it's a diagnosis. He is fast, cruel, and absolutely convinced of his divine mission. By the end of the spring of 1395, he gathers an army that made European kings' knees tremble just by looking at it. 40,000 blades. 40,000 men who had passed through the fires of the Balkans and Anatolia. It is a steel avalanche, ready to wipe a tiny principality on the northern bank of the Danube off the face of the earth. Bayezid crosses the river. He expects to meet the orderly ranks of the Wallachian army. He craves a pitched battle, that very moment when two walls of steel crash into each other with a roar, and the winner takes all. But instead, he is met with silence. Absolute, ringing silence. A plain stretches before the Sultan, but there isn't a soul on it. Villages? Burned to the ground. Fields? Black with ash. Barns? Empty. Mircea the Elder did something that no Western knight could wrap his head around. He didn't defend his cities. He destroyed them with his own hands. Ask yourself a question right now, sitting in comfort. Could you set fire to the house your father built with your own hands? Could you slaughter the livestock that fed your family and poison the well in your own yard, just so the enemy wouldn't get a single drop of clean water? It's a choice that breaks the psyche. But for Mircea, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was a strategy. He turned blooming Wallachia into a dead zone. Bayezid is furious. He is used to fighting men, not ghosts. His huge army, This leviathan of war designed for crushing blows suddenly turns out to be useless. Imagine trying to kill a mosquito with a sledgehammer. You waste energy, you get angry, you smash the furniture, but the mosquito is still buzzing in your ear. The Ottoman armada moves inland, day after day, week after week. The sun of 1395 beats down mercilessly and then gives way to torrential rains that turn roads into swamps. And here begins the real nightmare, the invisible war. The Wallachians do not accept battle. They have dissolved. They have become part of the landscape. The forest surrounding the Ottoman columns isn't just trees, it's eyes. Thousands of eyes. Every bush, every ravine could hide an archer. The Sultan's scouts ride into the thicket and do not return. Or they return, but in pieces, tied to the saddles of their own horses. This is a message. You are not welcome here. A soldier's psychology is a fragile thing. When you see the enemy, you can hit him. Fear takes shape. But when the enemy is invisible, fear becomes paranoia. Soldiers start shying away from their own shadows. The rustle of a branch causes panic, capable of stopping an entire regiment. Bayezid, this genius of lightning attacks, suddenly realizes that his speed doesn't matter here. He is striking at the void, and the void feels no pain. The void simply consumes. "Where is this coward?" The Sultan surely screamed in his tent, throwing goblets of sherbet. To him, raised on the code of a conqueror, Mircea's tactics were the height of villainy. How can you not come out onto the field? How can you run? But therein lies the grandiose mistake of imperial thinking. Bayezid sought glory. Mircea sought survival. And a man fighting for his life doesn't play by the rules. He goes for the throat. With every kilometer of the march, the majestic army turns into a hungry, embittered mob. Provisions are melting away. Foragers sent to find grain find only scorched earth and poisoned springs. Yes, water was also turned into a weapon. Imagine the thirst when you are walking in heavy chainmail under the scorching sun. You see a well. You rush to it, pushing comrades aside. You drink this murky sludge, and by evening your insides twist so hard you pray for death. Cholera and dysentery became Mircea's best generals. They killed without noise and without pity, mowing down the ranks of elite troops more effectively than any volley of arrows. But the scariest thing wasn't hunger or disease. The scariest thing was the waiting. Mircea masterfully managed the tempo of terror. He let the Ottomans walk 10 kilometers calmly, lulling their vigilance. And then, when the tension dropped a bit, he struck. Not a massive one, no, a small, pinprick strike. A dozen horsemen would fly out of the forest, hack down stragglers, and vanish faster than anyone could raise the alarm. It was a war of nerves. The Sultan's army didn't sleep. Try not sleeping for 3 days, expecting your throat to be slit at any second. Hallucinations become your companions. Tree shadows start to move. The rustling of leaves sounds like the whispers of conspirators. The discipline the Janissaries were so proud of began to burst at the seams. Officers lost their voices trying to hold the line, but the same question was readable in the soldiers' eyes. Why are we here? What are we dying for in this cursed wilderness? Mircea, that old fox, watched. His spies reported every step the Sultan took. He knew that the enemy's huge numbers were his main weakness. 40,000 men need to be fed. 40,000 men need to be watered. A huge snake needs a lot of room to turn around. And Mircea was leading this snake to where it would strangle itself. He wasn't just retreating, he was luring. The Sultan thought he was the hunter cornering game. He saw burning villages and thought, aha, they are running, they are in panic. But in reality, he wasn't the hunter. He was the bull, charging with bloodshot eyes at a red rag, not noticing that behind the rag was an abyss. And this abyss was getting closer. The landscape changed. Plains gave way to hills. Hills turned into dense, impassable forests and boggy swamps. Roads narrowed. The army stretched out into a long, vulnerable gut. Bayezid, blinded by rage and the desire to punish the insolent Wallachian, ignored these signs. He marched forward, driven by his own pride, not understanding that every step deeper into Wallachia tightened the noose around his neck even tighter. Scorched earth tactics are cruel. It is inhumane to one's own people.
But look at a map of that time.
Bulgaria had fallen. Serbia had become a vassal. Byzantium was living out its final days, locked within the walls of Constantinople. The Ottoman steamroller was crushing everyone. Who is the real madman here? The one trying to stop a tank with a sword in hand, or the one blowing up the bridge under that tank's feet, even if his own belongings are standing on the bridge? Mircea made a choice. He sacrificed the present for the future. He turned his country into a testing ground of death, where every breath of air for the invader cost effort. And while the Sultan ground his teeth in impotent malice, looking at another pile of ashes where a village used to be, somewhere ahead, amidst the fog and quagmires, the stage was already being set for him, for the final act of this bloody play. The trap was set, and the beast had already lifted its paw over it. But the beast was too big and too hungry to look at its feet.
Hunger is a weapon that doesn't need sharpening.
It doesn't dull, it doesn't break, and it hits harder than Damascus steel. When 40,000 men march through a land where even the rats have fled from starvation, the greatness of the empire begins to crumble like old plaster. The supply wagons are empty. Horses, the pride of the Ottoman cavalry, turn into skeletons wrapped in skin. Soon, soldiers begin to look at their steeds not as combat comrades, but as food. First, they eat the fallen. Then, those who simply stumbled. And in the end, when despair covers their eyes with a red veil, knives plunge into the throats of still living horses to quell the spasms in empty stomachs for even an hour. Do you hear that sound? It's not a war horn. It's a cough. A dull, wet, lung-tearing cough. Mircea didn't just hide the food. He poisoned the environment itself. The water in the wells, which the advance units reached with such difficulty, turned out to be either salty or mixed with the cadaveric poison of fallen animals. Dysentery mowed down the rows of janissaries faster than Wallachian arrows. Imagine an elite warrior who trained all his life to kill with one blow, but now lies in his own filth, unable to even lift a spoon, burning with fever. This is a humiliating death. A death devoid of glory. A death that won't be written about in heroic chronicles. But if physiology killed the army by day, real terror came at night. Psychology. Mircea knew. A sleep-deprived man ceases to be human. He becomes an animal. A frightened, twitchy animal, with dulled reflexes. As soon as the sun hid behind the tops of the Carpathian spruces, the forest came alive. This wasn't an army-against-army attack. It was a wolf pack hunting a herd of blind sheep. The Wallachians attacked silently. They knew every path, every ravine, every route in this forest.
They appeared out of nowhere, from the darkness, from the fog, seemingly from under the earth itself. A knife blow to a sentry's neck, the whistle of an arrow piercing an officer's throat by the fire, a short, furious skirmish, and then again, silence. The Ottomans didn't see the enemy. They only saw shadows that killed. Try to imagine this state. You are standing guard. Your eyes water from the strain. You peer into the inky darkness of the forest. You think a tree took a step. You think a bush moved. Is it the wind? Or is it death? You wake a comrade, but no one is there. And an hour later, when your eyelids grow heavy as lead and you close your eyes for just a second, you will never open them again. "Shaitans," whispered the Janissaries, clutching amulets. Morale, the very backbone of Thunderbolt Bayezid's discipline, was bursting at the seams. Soldiers were afraid to sleep. They huddled in piles, back to back, flinching at every crack of a branch. Days merged into one endless gray mass, and nights turned into circles of hell. 3-4 days without normal sleep, and hallucinations begin. Janissaries started attacking bushes, hacking at trees, mistaking their own comrades for Wallachian saboteurs. Fights broke out in the camp. Friendly fire took no fewer lives than enemy raids. And what about the Sultan? Bayezid the Thunderbolt paced in his tent like a wounded lion. To his ego, this was unbearable. He came here to crush a bug, but the bug was leading him by the nose, forcing the great army to rot alive. His scouts brought only bad news, or didn't return at all. The Sultan's rage was terrible. He executed commanders for panic-mongering. He personally chopped off the heads of those who dared speak of retreat. "Forward! Only forward!" he roared, looking at a map that no longer had anything to do with reality. He thought he was chasing a coward. He thought Mircea was running in fear. Bayezid, blinded by anger, was making the classic tyrant's mistake. He confused strategic retreat with flight. He saw the enemy's back and thought it was victory. But in reality, Mircea was a matador waving a cape in front of the snout of an enraged bull, step by step leading him to the slaughterhouse. And the terrain changed, as if the nature of Wallachia itself was in collusion with the voivode. Wide roads turned into narrow paths where two horsemen could barely pass each other. Solid ground gave way to viscous, sucking mud. Forests became denser, darker, their crowns intertwining overhead, blocking out the sky. The armies stretched for kilometers. The head of the column was already entering gloomy gorges, while the tail was still stomping on the plain. Communication between units was lost. Orders arrived late or not at all. The great Ottoman organism was dismembered by geography. Logistics collapsed completely. Wagons with supplies, those pitiful crumbs that remained, got stuck in swamps up to the hubs. Artillery, the pride of the Ottomans, heavy bombards capable of crushing the walls of Constantinople, became a burden. Huge cannons sank in the mud. Soldiers tore their tendons trying to pull these useless pieces of bronze. They cursed everything: the Sultan, Allah, this cursed land, and especially this endless, drizzling rain that turned the world into a gray mess. Mircea waited for this moment. He knew the limits of human endurance. He knew that a hungry, sleep-deprived soldier soaked to the bone, walking knee-deep in mud, is worth 10 well-fed ones standing on solid ground. Methodically, with the cold calculation of a surgeon, he brought the patient to a state where resistance would become impossible. By October 10th, 1395, the Ottoman army reached a place the locals called Rovine. It wasn't just a lowland, it was a geographical trap. A swampy plain cut by ravines, hence the name Rovine, meaning trenches, densely overgrown with old forest and brush. The perfect place for an ambush. A nightmare for cavalry. A grave for an empire. Bayezid, seeing the forest ahead becoming impassable, finally stopped. But it was too late. He was already inside. The walls of the trap rose up. The forest around went quiet, but it wasn't the dead silence of the beginning of the march.
It was the silence before an intake of breath, the silence of a drawn bowstring. Thousands of eyes watched the exhausted army stuck in the mud. Thousands of hands rested on the hilts of swords and bows. The Sultan sought battle. He got it. But not on his terms. Not in an open field where his sipahis could deploy like lava and sweep away everything living. Number. He got a battle in the mud, in close quarters, amidst roots and rotten water.
Mircea the Elder, the architect of this hell, stood somewhere there among the trees, and perhaps for the first time in all this while, allowed himself the shadow of a grim smile. Playtime was over. The time for slaughter had begun. Welcome to Rovine. If you think hell is fire and brimstone, you are mistaken. Hell is water, clay, and the inability to take a breath. On October 10th, 1395, the Ottoman war machine, which had known no defeats, drove into this hell at full speed and got stuck in it up to its belly. Imagine you are a sipahi, an elite heavy horseman. You are wearing 30 kilograms of excellent steel. Your horse costs a fortune. You are a tank of the 14th century. On solid ground, you are invincible. But here, in the lowland the locals call Rovine, which literally means trenches or ditches, physics works against you. The ground under the hooves doesn't hold. It squelches, sags, and finally bursts like rotten fabric. First, the horse sinks into the mud up to the fetlock, then to the knee. The animal starts to panic. You hit it with spurs, trying to break free, but every sharp movement only sucks you deeper into the quagmire. You are no longer a horseman. You are a statue, waiting to be smashed. And then they come. First it was a sound, a whistle like the singing of angry wasps, and then the sky darkened. Wallachian archers, hidden behind a wall of trees and brush, opened fire. This wasn't chaotic shooting. It was an execution. Arrows didn't seek gaps in armor. There were so many of them that they created their own weather, hail made of iron and wood. Horses, crazed with pain, threw their riders into the mud, and a knight in full armor who has fallen into the mud is no longer a warrior. He is a turtle turned on its back. Try to stand up when you have 30 kilograms of iron on you and liquid soap half a meter deep under your feet. You flounder. You try to find footing, but your hands slip. Water pours into the helmet's eye slits. Mud clogs your nose. You start suffocating even before the enemy touches you. Armor that was supposed to save your life becomes a coffin made to measure. It is at this moment that Mircea gives the signal to the infantry. And here begins the true asymmetry of war. The Wallachians are lightly dressed, leather jackets, wool cloaks, no heavy armor. They know every bump here. They don't walk on the mud, they glide over it. In their hands are not noble swords. They have scythes reforged into combat blades, axes, and long hooks. Have you ever seen a butcher dismantle a carcass? The same thing was happening here, only on the scale of an army. Wallachian peasants, whom Ottoman nobles despised as dirty rabble, hooked noble horsemen by the necks and dragged them out of their saddles straight into the swamp. The outcome of the skirmish was decided not by fencing skill, but by who could get back on their feet faster. The Wallachians were always faster. Sultan Bayezid watched this from high ground, and his heart must have skipped a beat. His Thunderbolt struck the ground, but instead of a fire, the swamp swallowed it. He saw his famous janissaries, men who dedicated their lives to war, drowning in confinement and chaos. The formation fell apart. Officers' commands drowned in the screams of the dying and the neighing of horses.
It was claustrophobia under the open sky. Thousands of people were compressed onto a narrow patch of land, unable to swing a sword or turn around to flee. The rear ranks pushed on the front ones, shoving comrades straight onto Wallachian spears. Ottoman chronicles describe this day sparingly, as if ashamed of the details. Horses drowned, and swords could not cut. But behind these dry lines lies a meat grinder.
Mircea the Elder used geography as a giant vice.
He compressed the enemy's numerical superiority to such a degree that it became their main problem. The more soldiers Bayezid threw into battle, the tighter it became in the trap. The more people died not from enemy hands, but from crushing and suffocation. It was a triumph of cynicism over pathos. While the Ottomans tried to wage a proper war, aligning ranks and raising banners, the Wallachians waged a war for survival. They struck at the horses' legs. They finished off the wounded with clubs. They didn't take prisoners, because there was nothing to feed prisoners with. Rovine turned into a slaughterhouse, where the pride of the empire mixed with mud and blood so densely that the earth in this valley, they say, didn't dry out for several years. By midday it became clear. The Invincible army was paralyzed. Bayezid, used to deciding the outcome of a battle with one swift blow, found himself a spectator at his own funeral. His reserve stood idle, unable to squeeze through to the front line through piles of corpses and mud. His best cavalry was fertilizing the Wallachian soil. Could you keep your sanity, seeing the myth of your own invulnerability crumbling? Bayezid couldn't. He continued sending men forward into this black hole, refusing to believe that a bunch of forest bandits were humiliating the heirs of Rome. But every new reinforcement only increased the scale of the catastrophe. Blood flowed into the ravines, mixing with rainwater, turning streams into brown, thick torrents. Mircea wasn't just winning a battle. He was breaking the spine of Ottoman psychology. He showed that even a god can be made to crawl on his belly if you choose the meeting place correctly. When the sun began to dip towards sunset, illuminating mountains of corpses piled in the swamp, it became clear even to the Sultan's most fanatical commanders, this is not a battle. This is punishment.
And when twilight began to thicken over Rovine, hiding the scale of the massacre, a question hung in the air that was scarier than death. What to do next? The great army was not just beaten, it was humiliated. Thunderbolt Bayezid faced a choice: throw the remnants of his troops into this fire, hoping for a miracle, or admit that the old wolf had bitten through his throat. But while the Sultan was deciding, night was already claiming its rights, and in the forests of Wallachia, the night does not belong to men. It belongs to those who know how to see in the dark. The hell in the swamps was over, but for the survivors, the nightmare was just beginning. The silence that descended on the battlefield was heavier than the roar of battle. It was the silence of understanding. The empire is mortal. The fog over the swamps of Rovine dissipates slowly, reluctantly revealing a picture that makes you want to squint. But we won't squint. We will look. Because it is here, in the morning dampness, among thousands of bodies trampled into the clay, that the fate of not just a battle, but an entire nation is being decided. The Wallachian army accomplished the impossible. The vanguard of the Ottoman Empire, elite shock troops, the immortal Janissaries, is destroyed. The great Thunderbolt Bayezid received a slap in the face, the ring of which echoed throughout Europe. It would seem, here it is, the moment of triumph. Any knightly romance would end here with fanfares. The hero finishes off the villain, music plays, curtain. But real war is not a romance. It is the accounting of death. And when Mircea the Elder looks at the battlefield, he doesn't see victory. He sees numbers. Let's count with him. He has left maybe 10,000 men, tired, wounded, with notched swords and empty quivers. And what does the Sultan have?
Yes, the vanguard is smashed. Yes, Ottoman morale is at rock bottom.
But behind Bayezid still stands the reserve. 20, maybe 30,000 fresh soldiers who didn't participate in the meat grinder in the swamp. They are angry, they want revenge, and they are still damn dangerous. This is the very moment where great commanders break. The adrenaline of victory is a terrible drug. It whispers in your ear, "Finish him, chase him, you are invincible." How many kings died yielding to this whisper? How many armies were destroyed chasing a wounded beast into its den? Mircea the Elder was a genius not because he knew how to swing a sword, but because he knew when to stop. He understood. If he led his men out of the saving swamps into the open space to pursue the Sultan, the Ottoman cavalry would simply flatten them like a pancake. Numbers are still on the enemy's side. Physics is still on the enemy's side. And the voivode makes a decision that will seem like cowardice to many, but which is actually the highest manifestation of strategic intelligence. He orders not to pursue. He orders to disappear. Imagine the disappointment of his captains. "My lord, they are running! We can finish them!" But Mircea is adamant. He knows. A wounded lion is still a lion. And instead of seeking a glorious death in a hopeless counterattack, the Wallachian army does what it does best. It dissolves. It looked like a magic trick. 10,000 people, wagons, wounded, they all simply evaporated in the morning fog. They went deep into the forests, into the mountains, to secret bases that only the locals knew about. When Ottoman scouts, trembling with fear, finally dared to check the Wallachian positions, they found only extinguished fires and trampled grass. No one. Emptiness. Bayezid was left alone on the battlefield. Formally, by the laws of war of that time, if the enemy left and you stayed, you won. The Sultan immediately used this bureaucratic loophole. He sent messengers to all corners of the empire with news of a great victory over the infidels. Court chroniclers immediately began writing odes about how the Thunderbolt put the enemy to flight with a single glance. But let's look the truth in the eye. It was the bitterest, emptiest victory in the history of Ottoman conquests. Bayezid stood in the middle of a foreign, hostile country. His army was bled dry. His soldiers were starving. He had no provisions to continue the campaign, and no enemy to fight. He conquered a piece of dirty swamp. Congratulations, Your Majesty. What will you do with it? Eat mud? Build a palace on bones? The atmosphere in the Ottoman camp was funereal. Soldiers aren't fools. They saw how many comrades didn't return from the forest. They knew the Wallachians weren't beaten, but just waiting. Waiting for the Ottomans to relax. Waiting for the next mistake. Every bush still breathed a threat. Every night still threatened an arrow in the throat. Bayezid realized he had been outplayed, not by force, but by wits. Mircea didn't give him the pitched battle the Sultan craved. Mircea imposed his rules, gutted the vanguard, saved his army, and left, leaving the Sultan holding the bag. It was a stalemate, but a stalemate in favor of Wallachia. The Sultan gave the order to retreat. Officially, it was called a return with triumph. In reality, it was a flight from a cursed land, where the water is poisoned and the forest kills. The Ottomans left, leaving behind not garrisons, but graves. They left knowing that as soon as the last Turkish boot crossed the Danube, Mircea would return, like the tide. Why didn't Mircea become a hero in shining armor? Because dead heroes don't protect countries. He chose to be a living ghost. He sacrificed ego for the survival of his people.
He showed the whole world that the Ottoman colossus could be beaten, that it bleeds, that it makes mistakes. But Thunderbolt Bayezid wouldn't be a sultan if he only knew how to wave a saber. He was a smart, vengeful, and incredibly rich politician. Leaving Wallachia, he realized one important thing. Steel is powerless against fog. Swords get stuck in swamps. Cannons sink in mud. But there is a weapon that passes through any walls, that doesn't rust, and strikes more accurately than any arrow. Gold. If Mircea cannot be killed on the battlefield, he must be killed in his own home. If his soldiers are loyal to him, his generals must be bought. If the people consider him a savior, someone must be found who will promise the people peace and cheap bread. Bayezid was leaving, but he was already weaving a new web. A web of intrigue, betrayal, and bribery. The war of swords was over. The war of purses and whispers in dark corridors was beginning. And in this war, Mircea, ruined by scorched earth tactics, had far fewer chances than on the field of Rovine. The shadow of betrayal already hung over the voivode's throne, and this time the blow would be struck not by a janissary, but by a hand he was used to shaking. Do you hear that sound? A quiet, metallic clinking. It is much scarier than the roar of Ottoman cannons under fortress walls. It is the sound of gold being poured from a leather bag into a greedy palm. Bayezid the Thunderbolt was a great warrior, but he was also a genius politician. Leaving Wallachia in disgrace, he realized one simple truth. Why storm an impregnable wall if you can buy the one who opens the gates? Scorched earth tactics, which saved Wallachia from conquest, had a terrible price. Yes, it stopped the Turks, but it also ruined his own boyars. Imagine yourself in the place of a Wallachian aristocrat. Yesterday you had estates, peasants, income. Today, by order of your voivode, your villages are burned, livestock slaughtered, and barns empty. You sit in a cold castle, eating stale bread and looking at the ashes. And then the Sultan's envoy appears. He doesn't threaten, he smiles. He speaks your language, and he offers a deal. Why do you need this crazy old man Mircea, who forces you to starve? He whispers. The empire is generous. We will return your privileges. We will give you trade routes. We just want friendship. And, as a weighty argument, a heavy purse of gold dinars is placed on the table. What will outweigh the scales of history? Patriotism or comfort? In 99 cases out of 100, comfort wins. Heroism is the lot of loners. The elite always chooses stability. In the corridors of the Wallachian court, a conspiracy began to thicken. It wasn't a loud uprising with barricades. It was sideways glances, sudden silence when Mircea entered the room, and strange illnesses of commanders loyal to him. The atmosphere became viscous, like that fog at Rovine. Mircea felt it. The ground he defended with such fury was slipping out from under his feet. But this time the enemy wasn't in the forest. He was sitting at his own table, drinking his wine and swearing allegiance to him. The blow was struck quickly and with surgical precision. The boyars, bribed by Ottoman gold, declared Mircea deposed. "You brought us only war and hunger," they said. A man named Vlad was put on the throne. History will remember him as Vlad I, or Vlad the Usurper. He was the perfect puppet, a man without will, without ambition, whose only task was to nod on time when the Sultan sent decrees and duly pay tribute. Wallachia, which just yesterday was an anvil breaking Ottoman hammers, instantly turned into a submissive vassal. Without a single shot fired, without a single casualty. just business. Bayezid bought an entire country for a price less than the cost of equipping one regiment of janissaries. And what about Mircea?
Imagine the humiliation of a man who won the war, but lost the peace.
He wasn't killed. That would have made him a martyr, and martyrs are dangerous. He was simply squeezed out, thrown out like a used rag. The great strategist, the victor at Rovine, turned into a homeless fugitive. He flees north to Transylvania. The passes of the Carpathians, covered in snow, meet him with an icy wind. Yesterday he was a sovereign whose name thundered from the Danube to Constantinople. Today he is in exile, with a handful of loyal men who have nothing but rusty swords and anger. But Mircea wouldn't be himself if he gave up. He had no army, no gold, no throne, but he had a reputation. And he knew geopolitics better than anyone in Europe. He understood. Bayezid won't stop at Wallachia. Wallachia is just a staging ground. The next target is Hungary. And Mircea makes a move that proves there are no eternal enemies in politics, only eternal interests. He goes to Brasov to meet with the King of Hungary, Sigismund of Luxembourg. It was a meeting full of irony. Sigismund and Mircea hated each other. For years they argued over territories, staged border skirmishes. But now they sat across from each other, realizing that alone they are corpses. "Your shield is broken, King," Mircea probably said, looking into the eyes of his old enemy. "Wallachia was the wall protecting you from the Sultan. Now that wall belongs to the Turks. You are next." It was a cruel, cynical conversation between two wolves cornered in a trap. Sigismund was arrogant. He was a proud man dreaming of the glory of Roman emperors. But he wasn't an idiot. He saw Ottoman fires on the other bank of the Danube. He understood that Vlad the usurper would let the Sultan's army pass through his lands without a single word of protest. An alliance was concluded, not on paper with beautiful seals, but on blood and fear. Sigismund promised Mircea support in regaining the throne. Mircea promised to become the living shield of Europe again. It was a deal with the devil to save themselves from Satan. In the gloomy halls of Transylvanian castles, while wolves howled outside the windows, a plan for revenge was being developed. Mircea the Elder, stripped of his crown but not having lost his grip, began to gather a new army. Mercenaries, exiles, adventurers, everyone who hated the Turks or simply loved money flocked to his banners. He knew the second chance would be the last. But while the two monarchs drew maps and argued about tactics, a new force was rising in the west. Europe, frightened by stories of the Turkish threat, finally woke up. The Pope declared a crusade. Knights of France, Germany, England, clad in shining armor, began saddling their horses. They weren't riding to help Mircea. They were riding for glory. They were riding to show these wild Eastern barbarians what real war is. Mircea looked at the arriving regiments of crusaders with a heavy feeling. He saw their luxurious plumes, their long lances, their coats of arms embroidered with gold. And he saw their eyes. There was no fear in them. There was no respect for the enemy. There was only blind, murderous pride. They understood nothing, the old voivode must have thought. They think war is a tournament. He tried to warn them. He tried to tell them about Bayezid's tactics, about the traps, about the fact that Turks don't fight by the rules of knightly honor. But who would listen to an exiled prince from some backwater? French dukes just laughed, patting him on the shoulder. "Step aside, Grandpa," their looks said. "The professionals have arrived. We will crush this sultan by lunch." Mircea stepped into the shadows. He knew what would happen. He had seen this scenario 1,000 times. Pride always goes before a fall, and the fall that was being prepared at Nicopolis promised to be so loud that the entire Christian world would shudder. The stage was set. The actors took their places. The tragedy of arrogance was beginning, and Mircea was assigned the role of the most prescient spectator in the front row. September 1396. Look at the plain near Nicopolis. If you squint, you might think you've arrived at the most luxurious tournament in human history. Gold, velvet, silk, coats of arms embroidered with precious threads. This isn't an army. It's a traveling exhibition of the achievements of European jewelry art. The flower of chivalry, French, Burgundians, Germans, English, gathered here on the banks of the Danube to show the wild Ottomans what real war is. They brought with them not just swords, they brought wine, mistresses, and even hunting falcons. For them, the crusade was not hard work, but a safari. An exciting journey with elements of violence, at the end of which glory, trophies, and eternal salvation of the soul awaited them. They were absolutely sure. As soon as the Turkish rabble saw the shine of their armor, the enemy would scatter in terror. In the War Council tent reigned an atmosphere that can be described in one word: arrogance. Mircea the Elder, a man who had fought the Ottomans all his life, a man who knew every trick of Bayezid, tried to speak. He proposed a simple, pragmatic plan. "Let my Wallachians go first," he said. "We know their tactics. We will take the first blow, disrupt their ranks, wear out their archers, and only then will you, noble knights, deliver the decisive blow." Do you know what they answered him? They laughed in his face. Philip of Artois, Count of Eu, Constable of France, looked at Mircea like dirt under his fingernails. For some peasant to go ahead of the nobility of France, the knights were outraged. "You want to steal our glory?
You want us to eat scraps from your table?"
For Western knights, war was a ritual. For Mircea, war was mathematics. But on that day, mathematics was declared heresy. The Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, young, hot-headed, and absolutely incompetent in matters of Eastern warfare, demanded an immediate attack. Without reconnaissance, without preparation, straight head-on. "If the sky falls on us, we will hold it up on the points of our lances," they shouted, raising their goblets. A beautiful phrase for a tombstone. On the morning of September 25th, the steel avalanche moved forward. The spectacle was truly majestic. Thousands of the world's best horsemen, clad in Milanese armor, under fluttering banners, crashed into the Ottoman advance units. And exactly what Bayezid was waiting for happened. The French easily crushed the light infantry, the Akinji. They chopped them like cabbage, reveling in their own power. "They are running!" shouted the knights, seeing the Turks retreat. "Victory!" It was a drug. Adrenaline hit their heads, shutting down the last remnants of common sense. The knights, breaking formation, rushed in pursuit. They raced up the hill, sure that the Sultan was already trembling in fear. They didn't listen to orders. They competed to see who would get to the Turkish camp first. They flew over the crest of the hill and froze. Because behind the hill, it wasn't a fleeing crowd waiting for them. Waiting for them was a palisade of sharpened stakes driven into the ground at an angle. And behind the stakes stood the Janissaries, silent, disciplined, with bows in their hands. And behind them, as far as the eye could see, lined up the heavy Sipahi cavalry, the reserve Bayezid had saved for this exact moment. The French found themselves in a classic sack. Horses impaled themselves on stakes, ripping open their bellies.
Riders flew out of saddles, breaking bones under the weight of their own armor.
And then, the Janissaries opened fire. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter in a cattle pen. Knights, used to tournament rules where you can surrender and pay a ransom, suddenly discovered that here those rules didn't work. They were dragged off horses with hooks. Their throats were slit through visor slits. They were finished off with maces like mad dogs. Dukes, counts, barons, the flower of European aristocracy, floundered in dust mixed with blood, screaming for mercy in a language no one understood. Bayezid watched this with cold satisfaction. He punished them for their pride. He showed them that war is not a parade of beautiful coats of arms, but the skill of killing effectively. And what about Mircea? He stood with his Wallachians and King Sigismund's Hungarian units in the rear, watching French madness turn into French tragedy. He saw the trap snap shut.
He saw Sigismund desperately try to save the situation by throwing infantry into battle, but it was already too late. The Ottomans, inspired by the rout of the Iron Men, counterattacked from the flanks. At that moment, Mircea faced a choice: rush into this inferno to heroically die with the idiots who spat on his advice, or save what was left of his army. Mircea was a cynic. He was a survivor. He turned his horse around. "We are done here," was readable in his eyes. He led his troops to the crossing over the Danube, methodically destroying the bridges behind him. Some will call it betrayal. Historians will call it saving the army. If Mircea had stayed, Wallachia would have ceased to exist that same day. He chose to live with the brand of a cautious ally, rather than lie a dead hero in a mass grave at Nicopolis. The result of the day was monstrous. Thousands of knights were killed. Thousands were taken prisoner. Bayezid, enraged by heavy losses among his own, ordered the prisoners executed. All the next day, Janissaries methodically beheaded the flower of the French nation. The Sultan left alive only a handful of the most noble rich men for ransom, and one young knight, whom he released home with a message: "Go and tell them what you saw, and come back with a bigger army. I need glory." Europe froze in horror. The myth of the superiority of Christian weapons was drowned in the Danube. The road to the west was open. Hungary trembled. Wallachia was once again one-on-one with the monster, which now, after defeating the combined forces of Europe, seemed absolutely invincible. Bayezid stood on top of the world. He called himself the Sultan of Rome. He prepared plans to capture Vienna and Rome. It seemed the sun itself now rose and set by his command. No one and nothing could stop his triumphal march. But history loves cruel jokes. While Bayezid feasted in his tent, raising goblets to the greatness of the Ottoman Empire, while European kings wept over lists of the dead, in the distant east, in the steppes of Central Asia, a shadow began to gather. A shadow that was blacker than night and scarier than any sultan. There, a beast was waking up that knew neither pity, nor politics, nor fear. A man who built pyramids not of stone, but of human skulls. Bayezid thought he was the scourge of God, but he didn't yet know that the devil himself was already coming to visit him. And this devil had a limp. Imagine looking at a map of the world at that time. The Ottoman blot is spreading, devouring country after country. Europe is in terror. France mourns its sons. Hungary trembles. Constantinople suffocates in a ring of blockade. It seems history is already written, and the ink has dried. Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, will become the master of the world. He was already preparing fodder for his horses, dreaming they would eat oats from the altar of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This isn't a joke, this was his official goal. But history is not a straight line. It is chaos. And sometimes, salvation comes not from where the righteous expect it. It comes not with angelic trumpets and divine light,
It comes from the east, riding a short-legged horse, limping on the right leg, leaving behind mountains of skulls stacked in perfect pyramids. The savior of Europe was named Timur, or Tamerlane, the Iron Lame One. If Bayezid was a hammer, Tamerlane was an earthquake. A man who drowned half of Asia in blood, who wiped the Golden Horde and Delhi off the face of the earth, suddenly turned his heavy, unblinking gaze to the west. Two alpha predators ended up in the same cage. The world was too small for two men, each of whom considered himself the scourge of God. In the year 1400, a correspondence began that historians reread with nervous laughter. This isn't diplomacy. It is an exchange of spit between two street thugs of galactic scale. "You are more insignificant than an ant," Timur wrote to the Sultan. "Do not force an elephant to step on you." Bayezid answered with the fury of a man who had never been refused. "Come. If you do not come, then your wives are thrice divorced from you." In the Islamic world, this was an insult that is washed away only with blood. Total blood. For Mircea the Elder, sitting in his Wallachia, it looked like the intervention of higher powers. Imagine, a train is rushing at you. You squeeze your eyes shut, expecting impact, but suddenly another locomotive, even more huge and black, slams into that train from the side. The crash is so loud it deafens you. On July 20th, 1402, two of the greatest armies of the era clashed near Ankara. About 140,000 men on Timur's side, almost the same number for Bayezid. It was a clash of titans, next to which European battles seemed like backyard brawls. And here again played a role that same pride that ruined the knights at Nicopolis. Bayezid, blinded by his past successes, made a fatal mistake. He forced his army to march to meet the enemy across the scorching Anatolian plateau in the very heat of summer. Soldiers walked across the scorched steppe, dreaming of a sip of water, and when they, half dead from thirst, finally reached the battlefield, they saw that Timur was already there. He had occupied the best positions, and, most importantly, he had diverted the bed of the only stream to the side. The water was with Timur. Bayezid had only dust. History repeated itself. The Sultan, who himself suffered from thirst in the Wallachian forests, learned nothing. Only now the scale of the catastrophe was 10 times larger. The Battle of Ankara turned into hell. Imagine heat near 40 degrees. Dust stands like a pillar, clogging lungs. And in this haze, moving toward the exhausted Ottomans are not just horsemen. Moving toward them are war elephants clad in armor, with towers on their backs from which archers spray the infantry with fire and Greek fire. The Ottoman army began to melt. But the stab in the back that finally broke the Thunderbolt's spine was not delivered by elephants. It was delivered by his own. Light cavalry of Anatolian beys and Tatar mercenaries, seeing Timur's power, turned their horses right in the middle of the battle and struck the Sultan's flanks. Betrayal? Undoubtedly. But in the world of big politics, this is called timely changing of sides. Bayezid fought like a demon. His janissaries stood to the death around their lord until they were killed one by one. By sunset, it was all over. The great Sultan, conqueror of the Balkans, terror of Europe, lay in the dust, bound like a common thief. Legend has it that Timur put Bayezid in an iron cage and carted it around with him all over Asia, using the defeated monarch as a footstool when mounting his horse. Historians argue whether there really was a cage, or if it was a covered wagon with bars, but the essence doesn't change. The lightning was caught in a bottle. The humiliation was absolute. Bayezid died in captivity a year later, some say from poison, some from a broken heart, unable to bear the shame. For Wallachia, this was the moment time stopped. Mircea the Elder looked south and didn't believe his eyes. The Ottoman Empire, this monolith that seemed eternal, suddenly cracked and shattered into pieces. Bayezid's sons, barely hearing of their father's capture, abandoned the army and began tearing at each other's throats for the empty throne. Europe exhaled. Tamerlane, having done his job as forest sanitizer, turned around and went east, preparing to march on China. He didn't need Europe. It was too poor and boring for him. He just broke the Ottoman's spine, took the trophies, and disappeared like a bad dream. But for Mircea, it wasn't a dream. It was a gift of fate. The Deus ex machina descended onto the stage and rewrote the play's finale. The pressure vanished. The Ottoman garrison left. The threat of imminent slavery dissolved into thin air. Wallachia, just yesterday squeezed in a vice, suddenly found itself free. However, Mircea was too smart to just rejoice and drink wine. He understood. Chaos is a ladder. The empire didn't die, it was concussed. And while the Sultan's sons were dividing the skin of a bear that wasn't dead yet, little Wallachia had a historic chance. Not just to survive, not just to sit it out in defense, but to go on the offensive. Not military, no, Mircea didn't have the strength to conquer the empire. But he had the mind to start ruling it from the shadows. The old voivode shook the dust off his armor. A new fire lit up in his eyes. The cold fire of a gambler who sees the croupier at the table has died and the chips have scattered on the floor. The era of the interregnum was coming. An era of turmoil. A time when a small man with a big mind can make and unmake kings. Mircea survived hell. He survived the flood. And now he was going to become the architect of this chaos. The death of Bayezid was not the end of the story, but the beginning of the most audacious geopolitical scam of the 15th century. The old wolf was coming out of the forest to show the puppies how big politics is done. Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder. And while Bayezid's heirs tore at each other's throats trying to climb out of the pit of defeat, Mircea the Elder began his ascent up this ladder, step by step. Imagine a map of the Ottoman Empire in 1403. It is no longer a monolith. It is a broken mirror. Shards of a once great power lie underfoot, and each of them is sharp as a razor. Bayezid left behind not only a destroyed army, but also 4 sons: Suleiman, Isa, Mehmed, and Musa. 4 hungry wolves locked in one cage. Each of them believed he was the one worthy to carry the sword of Osman. Each of them was ready to kill his brother for power. For any neighbor of the empire, this would be a reason to stock up on popcorn and watch the slaughter from the sidelines. But Mircea wasn't a spectator. He was a player. And he understood, the best way to secure your own home is to pour oil on the fire consuming your neighbor's house. The golden age of Wallachian diplomacy begins. Or, to call things by their proper names, the era of great intrigue. Mircea the Elder, this forest voivode, whom European courts had recently written off, suddenly becomes the main puppeteer in the Balkans. He turns into a kingmaker. His strategy was brilliantly cynical. He didn't want the strongest to win. A strong sultan is a threat. He needed the war to last forever. So Mircea chooses the weakest, most vulnerable of the brothers, Musa Çelebi. Musa was a fugitive, a man without an army and without hope. The perfect tool. Mircea invites Musa to Wallachia. Imagine this scene. An Orthodox prince hosts a Muslim prince, gives him money, gives him soldiers, gives him bread. Not out of charity. Mircea is investing in chaos. Go, he tells him, handing him a sword. Go and take your throne. Kill your brother Suleiman, who rules in Europe. It was a masterclass in geopolitics. Wallachian regiments, the very ones that recently hid in swamps, now march south, invading Ottoman lands not as victims, but as allies of a contender for the throne.
Mircea uses Musa as a battering ram to knock Suleiman out of Adrianople. And it works. 10 years. For 10 whole years, the Ottoman interregnum torments the empire. And for all these 10 years, Mircea's hand is on the pulse of events. He pulls the strings, pitting brothers against each other. As soon as one of them starts to win and gain too much power, Mircea immediately switches support to another. It is balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong step, and you are a corpse. But Mircea dances on this blade with the grace of an old acrobat. During this period, Wallachia reaches the peak of its power. Mircea regains Dobruja, a strategically important region with access to the Black Sea. He controls the mouth of the Danube. His coins circulate throughout Europe. He styles himself autocrat and lists in his title lands he previously didn't dare dream of. The prince who started with guerrilla warfare in the mud now dictates terms to the heirs of the Sublime Porte.
Think about the irony of the situation. A Christian ruler decides who will be the caliph of the faithful. The Ottomans, who threatened to reach Rome, now travel to Targovishte to ask the Wallachian for money to fight each other. Mircea showed the world that a pen and a sack of gold sometimes hit harder than a scimitar. But this game had a flip side. Mircea became too overconfident. He got used to the Ottomans being weak. He got used to them being busy with slaughter in their own bedroom. He began to believe it would always be this way. He forgot an old truth. Wounds heal. Scars remain, but muscles recover. Civil war is a terrible thing, but it works like natural selection. The weak die. The stupid die. Only one remains. The cruelest. The most cunning. The strongest. In the crucible of fratricidal war, a new type of sultan was being forged. Not a spoiled heir, but a surviving beast who passed through betrayal and the blood of his own brothers.
By 1413, the chessboard began to empty.
Isa was killed. Suleiman was killed, with the active participation of Mircea's protege. Musa, whom Mircea had cultivated so carefully, also turned out not to be eternal. The last player remained on stage, Mehmed I. Mehmed was not a puppet. He was the one who cut the strings. He looked north at Wallachia, and his gaze promised nothing good. He remembered everything. He remembered who funded his enemies. He remembered where the mercenaries came from. He remembered the humiliation of his family. Mircea the Elder, sitting in his castle, must have felt the wind change. It smelled of ozone before a storm. The time for intrigues was ending. The empire he tried so diligently to dismember was knitting back together into a single, monstrous organism. The Leviathan considered dead opened its eyes. And the first thing it saw was the old voivode who had played God for too long.
Luck is a resource that tends to run out, and Mircea's counter was showing zeros. A storm is coming, and this time hiding from it behind the backs of puppets won't work. Silence. Sometimes it hits the ears harder than the roar of artillery. For 10 years, the Balkans shook with the screams of the dying in civil war, with the clashing of swords and drunken laughter of mercenaries. This was music to Mircea the Elder's ears. While a fire raged in the neighbor's house, his own house was safe. But in 1413, the noise died down. The dust settled. And out of the smoke stepped a figure that made the blood freeze in the old voivode's veins. Mehmed I, the man who killed his brothers. The man who glued the broken vase of the Ottoman Empire back together not with glue, but with iron and blood. Look at this new sultan.
This isn't the hot-tempered Bayezid who rushed into battle headlong, and this isn't the weak Musa who could be controlled by pulling strings. Mehmed is cold calculation. This is pragmatism raised to an absolute. He went through a decade of hell. He saw betrayal. He saw yesterday's friends stabbing in the back. He has no illusions. And, what is scariest for Wallachia, he has an excellent memory. He remembers who sponsored his enemies. He remembers where the mercenaries came from. He looks at the map, and his gaze stops on the northern bank of the Danube. To Mehmed, Mircea isn't just an enemy. He is a splinter that has been festering for 30 years. He is the architect of chaos, who must be eliminated so the empire can breathe. And now look at Mircea. Time is the most ruthless killer, and it got to him too. He is already over 50. For the Middle Ages, this is deep old age. Remember how many times he was a hair's breadth from death? How many nights he spent in the saddle? How many friends he buried? He is tired. His hands, once firmly holding a sword, now tremble. But the scariest thing isn't physical infirmity. The scariest thing is loneliness. Look around him. Where are his allies? Where are those with whom he drank wine and divided maps of Europe? King Sigismund of Hungary is busy with his imperial affairs in Germany. He has no time for Wallachian problems. Byzantium is a living corpse awaiting burial. The Bulgarian kingdom does not exist. Serbia is a vassal. Mircea is left alone. The last of the Mohicans of his generation. An old wolf surrounded by young, hungry dogs. In 1419, the Leviathan returns. The Ottoman army approaches the Danube again. But this is no longer the motley crowd Mircea chased through the forests 20 years ago. Mehmed carried out reforms. Discipline is ironclad. Supplies are organized. It is a machine. A soulless, rhythmic machine of conquest. Mircea tries to use old tricks. He sends messengers again, tries to bribe pashas, tries to find dissenters. But this time there is silence in response. No one takes gold. No one wants to betray the Sultan who just executed all traitors. Communication channels that worked for years are cut. Manipulation no longer works. Imagine you are a magician, stepping on stage to show your best trick, but suddenly realize the rabbit in the hat is dead, and the audience knows the secret of your every move. That is exactly what Mircea felt. His magic, the magic of asymmetric warfare and diplomatic intrigue, had run dry. The Ottomans capture fortresses on the Danube. Giurgiu, Turnu, key outposts, gateways to the country, fall one after another. The Turks don't go deep into the forests. They don't repeat Bayezid's mistakes. They simply bite off pieces of territory, entrench themselves, build garrisons, and move on. Methodically, slowly, inevitably. It is the strategy of a boa constrictor. They don't want to chase Mircea. They just squeeze the rings, depriving him of air, resources, and hope. Gloom reigns at the voivode's headquarters. Young boyars look at the old man with a silent question. Well, where is your brilliant plan? Where is the miracle? But miracles don't happen on schedule. The deus ex machina that saved them in the form of Tamerlane will not come again. Tamerlane is dead. His empire fell apart even faster than it arose. Wallachia is left alone with physics. And the laws of physics state, if a huge press pushes on a small stone, the stone will crack. Mircea realizes this is the end. Not the end of life, but the end of the dream of total independence. He sees these endless columns with green banners crossing the river. He smells the burning that covers his land again. But this time he cannot tell the people, "Burn everything and go into the forest." People are tired. The country is exhausted by decades of war. Peasants just want to sow grain and know it won't be burned tomorrow. Boyars want to keep their heads. Mircea faces the most terrible choice of his life. Continue resistance? That means dooming the people to genocide. Mehmed won't stop. He will grind Wallachia into powder, settle it with immigrants from Anatolia, turn churches into mosques. Or swallow his pride. Admit that force breaks straw. Luck is not an infinite resource. It is a loan that fate gives to the brave. Mircea took this loan again and again. He bet everything and won. He cheated death, sultans, and kings. But history's debt collectors always come to collect, and now they stood at his doorstep, tapping their scimitars on the door. It was time to pay, and the currency they demanded was more expensive than gold. It was submission. The old architect of hell for the empire had to decide: burn in this hell himself, along with his creation, or make a deal with the devil to save at least the foundation of the house for his grandchildren. 1417. Imagine a tent. There are no screams, no clash of steel, no smell of blood. Here it smells of expensive wax, parchment, and humiliation. At the table sits an old man. His face is carved with wrinkles, like the map of the country he defended for 32 years. This is Mircea the Elder. Opposite him are the ambassadors of Sultan Mehmed I. In the voivode's hand is not a sword, but a quill. And this quill weighs more than any two-handed claymore. In this moment, the legend of the Invincible Knight dies, and the truth about politics is born. Mircea does what poets despise, but historians idolize. He signs a peace treaty. He agrees to pay tribute. 3,000 gold ducats a year, a huge sum. Money squeezed from the sweat and blood of his peasants. He agrees to send the sons of boyars as hostages to Istanbul. He bows his head. But look closer at this document. Read between the lines. This is not unconditional surrender. This is a deal with the devil, where the devil also makes concessions. Mircea buys not just life, he buys sovereignty. In the text of the treaty, there are clauses that make Ottoman mullahs grind their teeth. Not a single mosque on Wallachian soil. No Turkish administration. No pashas ruling cities. Wallachia keeps its army. Wallachia keeps its church. Wallachia keeps the right to choose its ruler. The Sultan gets gold, but does not get the soul of this land. Why did Mehmed, a ruler capable of crushing this principality, agree to such terms? Because Mircea, even in defeat, remained a bone in the empire's throat. The Sultan understood. He could occupy this land, but he couldn't digest it. The Wallachians would go into the forests, poison the water, and slaughter garrisons at night for another 100 years. It was cheaper to take the payoff. Pragmatism defeated fanaticism. Mircea the Elder walked out of that tent not a hero. Many called him a traitor. Many whispered that the old man had broken.
But let's be honest.
Dead heroes lie in the ground, and their names are erased by rain, while living politicians build the future. Mircea chose to be cursed by contemporaries, but justified by descendants. He kept the state on the map. Bulgaria disappeared for 500 years. Serbia dissolved. Byzantium was living out its last seconds. But Wallachia remained, humiliated, robbed, but alive. January 31st, 1418. Kozia Monastery. It is quiet here. Only the sound of the Olt River waters outside the walls and the quiet chant of monks can be heard. Mircea the Elder lies on his deathbed. He is 63 years old, an unthinkable age for that time, especially for a ruler who spent his whole life in the saddle. He is dying not from a Turkish arrow, and not from the poison of conspirators. He is dying in his own bed. This is his last, and perhaps most important victory. He outlived everyone. He outlived Thunderbolt Bayezid, who died in a cage. He outlived his sons, who slaughtered each other. He outlived Sigismund and the Burgundian dukes who rotted at Nicopolis. The old fox made it to the finish line, keeping the crown on his head, even if tarnished. But closing his eyes, what was he thinking about? Salvation of the soul? Unlikely. He thought about legacy, and this legacy was terrible. Mircea didn't leave his children a blooming garden. He left them an instruction manual for survival in a cage with tigers. He taught them that honor does not exist, that promises are dust, that the only currency that matters in this world is fear. He showed that for victory, you can burn your own cities. You can kill your own so that strangers fear you. You can be a monster if that monster stands guard at the gates. And this philosophy had a diligent student. Somewhere in the shadows, while the coffin with Mircea's body was being lowered into the stone crypt, a seed sown by his cruelty was already growing. His illegitimate son Vlad II, nicknamed Dracula, the dragon, would soon take power. And Vlad Dracula would have a son, Vlad III, a boy who would enter history under the name Tepes, the Impaler. Dracula. Vlad the Impaler didn't appear out of nowhere. He wasn't an anomaly or a crazy maniac born in a vacuum. He was a direct product of his grandfather's school. Those very stakes on which Vlad would impale thousands of Turks and boyars are the echo of the forest of stakes at the Battle of Rovine. The total terror that Dracula would unleash on enemies is Mircea's scorched earth tactics taken to the absolute. The grandson learned the grandfather's lesson too well. If you are small and weak, you must be so terrible that even giants bypass you. Mircea was the architect of this hell. Vlad Dracula became its manager. Dracula turned Mircea's pragmatic cruelty into art, into a bloody theater that horrified the world, but which, ironically, did exactly what the grandfather wanted: immortalized the name of Wallachia. A stone slab covered the grave in Kozia Monastery. The story of Mircea the Elder ended, but the history of blood he launched was just beginning. He was the one who showed that in a war of civilizations, the winner is not the one with the cleaner soul, but the one ready to dirty his hands up to the elbows. Wallachia survived, but the price of this survival was paid not in gold, but in humanity. Mircea proved that sometimes, to kill a dragon, you have to become a dragon yourself. And looking at the story of his grandson, one can say that the transformation was successful. We have walked this path from the first burning villages to the cold gravestone. You saw the mud of Rovine, the arrogance of Nicopolis, and the cynicism of diplomacy. And now I want to ask you one question, a question to which there is no right answer in textbooks. Imagine that the lives of millions of people, the life of your family, the existence of your language and culture depend on your decision. But to save them, you must become a monster. You must betray allies, kill innocents, poison the earth, and teach your children to be executioners. If you sat on Mircea's throne, knowing everything you know now, would you sign this contract with the devil? Or would you prefer to die with a clear conscience, allowing your people to disappear into oblivion? Who is the real hero here? The one who dies beautifully, or the one who lives in the mud so that others may live?